Hey guys, Chris at the Ultimate Recycler. Something different this week. This is some nice country Victorian cropping land out in Western Victoria, and this is the farm where I grew up. So this is my parents' place. They've been here for probably since the 1950s or so. So there's quite a nice crop of wheat in there. It's not a bad season this year. And I thought I'd just show you around the farmyard a little bit. We were just burning off some branches today, cleaning up a bit. Mum and Dad are both in their 80s, so some of the family comes home to help them out. That's our driveway down to the main road. So we live only a few kilometres out of, well, not even quite that, out of a little Victorian farming town. So when I say little, there's probably less than 1,000 people there. To some of you watching this, a small town might be 100,000 people. Well, we're talking a little village. A nice district though, farming district, and most of the businesses are structured around farming. There is a bit of sheep run around this country and some cattle, but it's mostly broadacre cropping. So you've got wheat and barley and field peas. Most of the farms are fairly large. You know, 1,000-acre farm or whatever that is in hectares is quite small these days, whereas back in my grandfather's days that was a pretty average farm. So we thought, look, I thought I'd just show you where I grew up. We'll have a look around the farmyard at some of my father's upcycling projects, and you'll probably get a bit of an understanding where I get my mindset from. Growing up on a farm, you tend to make do with what you've got, especially when my parents were heavily influenced from the Great Depression back in the 30s. They weren't quite around then, but of course they grew up in an era where you didn't waste and you made use of everything you could. So we'll have a look around the yard and I'll show you a few things. For a start, this is the barn where we keep the grain, and you can see it's actually built on stilts, and those stilts, if you look closely, are actually old stoneware water pipes or sewer pipes. And the idea of that, having it raised, was to keep mice and rodents out of the grain. So, you know, they used whatever they could, and quite often the job was much cheaper at the time, easier to do and very effective. So I'll have a bit of a walk around the yard and I'll show you a few things that you might be interested in. Just looking around the main yard now, you'll see a lot of silos and things because of course when you're a grain farmer you have to store the grain. This is Dad's workshop. Most farmers are fairly apt at welding and mechanics, and you tend to be a jack of all trades because you need to be to get things done. The roller door in this shed is actually the back of an old rental truck. Made use of a roller door. The little heater Dad's got here is actually made out of old cast iron truck brake drums. So there's one inverted on the other, welded together, sitting on a third one, and the cast iron on those brake drums are really thick. It's probably over an inch thick, and it does a great job of heating the workshop here. Now you can see it's a little bit of a disarray, but I'm sure Dad knows where everything is, and you know, you keep enough stuff and you're always going to find something to do the job. Nuts and bolts and a lot of hardware, because you don't want to have to run into their hardware shop just to grab a bolt to finish a job. And keep in mind, a little town doesn't stock what you people in larger centres have. So there's a large carport here, which I think Dad built himself. And there's just lots of building materials and things around the place because it's always handy to have stuff on hand. So of course there's lots of gates and bits of pipe and building materials around because you have to obviously maintain fences and things. This is an interesting piece of equipment. I think you'll be curious to see. Believe it or not, it's an old converted truck chassis. The early truck, I think it was a Chevy. It's probably a 1940s era truck, and Dad has converted it into a little towable trailer, and he's made use of the old hoist mechanism. And yes, it looks a bit primitive, but it's actually a crane and it works brilliantly. Now you couldn't get away with something like this these days, and this hasn't been used for quite some time, but back in its working life you'd hook it up behind the tractor. You'd run the PTO shaft there, which would drive a little oil pump, and with a control lever you could operate. There's a large hydraulic ram in here. You can see it's quite a large diameter, which of course used to lift the tilt on the back of the truck. It would have been I know, a 6-ton tilt tray, and Dad's managed to weld up a large crane jib, and he used to use it to lift 1-ton bulk of bags of fertilizer and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's a great piece of upcycling, that, turning an old truck chassis into a crane. As I said, these days with regulations and everything, you'd never get away with using something like this, especially with employees. But farmers are traditionally a very ingenious and inventive lot, and it's amazing what they can make out of pieces of equipment. So that's a great upcycling project. Some of these old field bins date back to the 40s, and Dad's always been very good at keeping old equipment going. So we've got a couple of old balers here, one that he used to use regularly, and another one he picked up at a clearing sale for parts. So that's another mindset too. You don't want to buy a new piece of equipment and then run off to the local repair shop to have it fixed every time there's a minor breakdown. You just won't make a living as a farmer doing that. You have to plan for breakdowns, work out how to fix them yourself. This old international harvester is ended up for parts too. And you know, you could pick them up for just above scrap metal price, and it saves you a fortune going to buy parts when your main head is broken down. I've just walked a bit further down the lane where a lot of the old equipment is, and here we have another old Chevy truck which has had the cab and engine removed and just converted into a towable trailer for bulk handling of grain. Now back in the 60s and 70s, this was, you know, you didn't get a lot better than this. You line up at the silos, and I'll pan around and you see some of the property. There's a nice crop of wheat there, looking really good actually, and the tree line way in the distance, just in front of that there's a railway line, and that's the end of our property here. You can see that yellow over there is a crop of canola in flower. The wheat's come up to head and it's looking pretty good, but Dad doesn't farm so much of it now, and the neighbour is Dad farms a bit of this, but the neighbours share farming some of the other land. And those huge buildings over there in the distance, I might have to move out a bit. You can see they're the local grain silos. So we're fortunate that it was never a big trip to unload the grain. And there's a huge big stick shed, or what's known as the stick shed, just behind those trees there, which was an emergency storage built in World War II. And it holds a massive amount of grain. And also they do bunkers as well. I think that blue area you can see there is actually bunkers covered in tarps. So it's in the middle of a big grain growing area. And just getting back to this old Chevy chassis with the bulk bin on it. Back in the 60s and 70s, you'd see a line of old trucks and these sort of things behind tractors. And you know, those were the days you had some really cool old trucks on the road. Nowadays they're all big B-doubles and massive semis, and very few little farmers take a small truck in anymore. It's all changed. Most of the little farms are now becoming big farms, and as Mum and Dad eventually wind things up here, this place will probably be sold to the neighbour, and his much bigger operation. And that's just the way farming is. Small family operations nowadays in Australia are really being phased out. So we'll have a bit of a walk further down the lane, see what else we can find. Down the other end of the laneway now, we've got a hay shed in there, and there's another harvester in that shed. There's a shipping container behind those trees there for a bit of storage, and the farmhouse is back in there. Some huge big old sugar gum trees that have been here for probably 100 years. They're starting to fall down. Big wood pile, some more silos, and from this angle we'll get a much better view of the large silos here in our local town. And you can see what's referred to as the stick shed on the left there. And if you Google Murtoa stick shed, it's like a huge indoor cathedral held up by hundreds of large poles, which are essentially just tree trunks. Quite amazing to see, and it's now heritage listed. But yeah, I think this is the biggest inland receival centre in Victoria. So because we're in such good cropping area here, it looks brilliant this time of the year. We're just into early spring, and we've had a pretty reasonable year. It's been reasonable rainfall, but in the drought years this can look desolate and barren and dusty. So it's not always this lush. It's probably the best time to see it. Anyway, we'll venture into the garden and see if we can find any more upcycle projects. And of course, on your way, you've got your custom-made gate latch, which of course incorporates a piece of bright pink hay band, because why wouldn't you? Alright, we're into the house yard now. It's as I said, we've had a pretty wet year, so there's been lots of grass growth and weeds, and it's a bit hard to keep up with it. I live 3 hours away, so I'm not always around to help. But Mum's always had a pretty comprehensive garden, some decorative, and of course, like most farmers, you like to be fairly self-sufficient with fruit and produce, so it's looking quite good in here. It's almost like a botanical gardens. So yeah, she does a good job to keep this up, but there's going to be a time when they can't manage it, of course. We'll duck through here, and there's a bit more veggie garden out here. There's some fruit trees, and I think we've been doing a bit of mowing out here. Now this is a good idea that we've seen used a bit over the years, is just to make a nice shade shelter for your plants, to hammer some star picket posts into the ground and get some nice thick poly pipe which is flexible, curve it over from one side to the other, and you've got a very easy to construct and quite solid shade house for your plants. So really cheap to make, and basically just use second-hand materials. Looks like the wheelbarrow is acting as a bit of a rain guard for the old rotary hoe there. This other little shade down here I want to show you, it's pretty cool. And just on our way, this is a hay elevator. Now it's been used as a ramp to put the large tank up on top of the tank stand. So there you go, a hay elevator has more uses than just elevating hay. Now it sounds like someone's coming back on the mower, so excuse the noise. Now around here, we've got a little shade house here. We've got a nice old wire screen door. We've also used some recycled shower glass panels because, you know, they've got a use, you may as well. And in this little shade area, Mum's been propagating some plants. It's got a really nice botanical feel to that, and it's made from an old stock crate frame that used to go on one of the trucks. And then all they've put is some plastic at the end, some clear laser light sheeting, a bit of plastic over the top, and it could have been, not sure what the material was from, and then some shade mesh above that. So what we've made here is a really nice microclimate for the plants, basically a nice little propagating room. And it's all been made out of basically stuff that was lying around. Now this old trailer here's a classic. It's been around as long as I can remember, so there's 50 odd years. And now Dad made this himself, and it's carried more loads of firewood and sand and stuff to the tip and sheep to market than probably what you've had hot dinners. It's got a bit of rust in the sides of it now, but it's as solid as the day it was made, I reckon, as far as the chassis goes. I was talking to him before about it, and he said these wheels were off a 1950s Ford Ute. So you know, they're 16-inch and they've got good solid heavy duty tyres on them, and it's got a good checker plate floor. And I think he said the axle was off an early plywood caravan, and the mudguards, no, it wasn't the mudguards, it was these side panels. The tin from these side panels were the old mudguards from a 1930s case tractor. So how's that for repurposing? It's looking a bit rough now, could probably use a coat of paint, but what a beautiful, certainly could use a new number plate. But what a beautiful old trailer, and it's still got a lot of life left in it. Okay, back over near the machinery yard, we've got the old Bedford truck and the main tractor and an old Chamberlain tractor. They've done a great job over the years, worked very hard on this property, pretty much in retirement now. Loading ramp here when Dad used to have cattle. In fact, I reckon there's a fair chance that loading ramp is actually made out of one of the chassis rails of an old Chevy truck as well. So great reuse of materials again. Got a bit of a chook yard here, there's no chickens around now. Half tanks make great little shelters for them. You'll see a lot of 44-gallon drums around the place. They turn up on every farm. They're always useful for things. And over this side we have a bit of a collection of scrap metal and steel and things that are going to be handy one day, because that's basically it. They will be handy one day. And eventually when we clean up this yard, well, some of it will probably go for scrap metal, or I've been salvaging what I can here to sell through my shop, so we can clean the yard up regularly. I try and get home as often as I can and help clean up and tidy up, with the view that eventually the property is going to be sold and Mum and Dad will have to retire into town or something. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the look around the yard. We didn't find a lot of upcycling projects, but you get a bit of an idea of the life I had growing up and how you just made do with things, and how, you know, Dad's rebuilt all these chook sheds. There's laying boxes made out of old weatherboards. Whatever material you can grab. This little item in the middle of the yard here, I actually made this frame years ago. We used to have a floodlight on it so it could be moved around the yard, and it now has a grister, which is a grain crusher mounted there, and it runs off the tractor via that flat belt. And the frame here is really just made up out of scraps. I used a couple of axles off God knows what. The wheels aren't even blown up, but it was good enough to just push around the yard. It made a mobile frame. So second-hand materials don't have to be sent off for scrap all the time. They can be very handy if you've got the room to stack them and store them. And there's a bit of a rack over here. If you keep stuff, and it's difficult to keep it neat and organised, but if you can, it's well worth it, because it's like having your own hardware store in your backyard. So okay, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this little video. It's a bit different to usual, but I'm over here for the week and thought I'd share where I grew up. So alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.